This video has been made with the purpose of education and awareness of real crimes, and there is no disrespect intended to anyone. This is to help promote truth and justice for anyone who has been a victim of crime. What I'm about to report is what I have researched online, and I will welcome any corrections should they be required. Hello there, little berry true crime fans. Eryberrie here. I hope you're all keeping well in the heat. I have the fan going again, and you know what I've got here? A friend of mine gave me this idea, a frozen hot water bottle. Credits to my friend. I don't want to reveal her name because anonymity, but yeah, she said putting hot water bottles in the freezer and then hugging them to yourself is a great way of keeping cool. And my kitten at the moment, I think, is feeling the heat because she's gone a bit loopy and demanding my attention. So again, I apologize if you hear anything strange in the background. The window is open. We might hear some dogs, might hear some traffic, seagulls. But I'm afraid that's what you have when you've just got a spare room to do what you do with YouTube amidst the heat. This case was on my list of cases to cover right from the beginning of the year when I wrote down a long list of all the cases I either was going to cover or thought about potentially covering. However, a few months ago, another true crime YouTuber called Molly Westbrook covered this case, and I thought then I'd leave it a few months before I would then cover it. So now I wish to do that, and it's taken a fair bit of research. There's quite a lot to it. There's some conflicting accounts, but it's a really, really interesting case. For this one, we're going to go back to the UK, specifically to the north of England, and we're going to concentrate on the Seddon family. Robert, Bob and Patricia Pat Seddon married in 1966, and they lived in Timpany in Altrincham. Not long after they married, they had two children, Stephen in 1966 and Lesley in 1967. Bob worked at BA, British Airways, as an engineer. He would do ground maintenance. I believe he worked there for pretty much all his adult life. He actually, I believe, got his pension from there in the end. He made quite a few friends, a fairly private person, but people said he was pleasant to be around. He was great fun. And he was just generally a well-loved man. He had, a couple of kids. He worked hard. His wife worked as a cleaner. She also was meticulous at keeping their home clean. So they weren't rich by any stretch. However, they had a comfortable living, and they gave their kids everything they could. One way that they would often try and have a social life but save money is they would have friends round over to entertain. They would have card games. Bob, on his time off, used to like to go and play bowls. That was a passion of his. That was a way for him to wind down. Bob was particularly close to his daughter, Lesley. And unfortunately, when she was 7 years old, she was diagnosed with epilepsy. It was so bad that she needed round-the-clock care. She still maintained that vibrant, bubbly personality, but I believe she lived with her parents pretty much all of her adult life. Stephen was more of a mummy's boy, and although Bob and Pat tried to give their kids everything they could, there did seem to be a little bit more attention on Lesley. Because she was ill, she needed more attention. And it's possible that may have caused some sort of resentment in Stephen. And when he was 13, he got involved with the wrong crowd, and he began burgling houses, stealing cars. He was in trouble with the police, and his father was furious with him about it. His mother kind of let him off the hook, and after a short stay in prison, Stephen decided when he was in his early 20s that he would get a legitimate job, and he did. He got jobs in sales and then worked his way up to management. In 1987, Bob's mother Doris passed away. She lived in a place called Clough Avenue in Sale, which was actually where Bob lived before he married Pat. And Bob and Pat decided that they wanted to keep the house, so they bought it. So Lesley, Bob and Pat all moved into the house in Clough Avenue. Stephen decided to set up his own company eventually when he was nearing his late 20s, early 30s. And when she was around 27, 28 years old, Lesley gave birth to a little boy called Daniel. Daniel had severe learning difficulties, and although as he grew up physically, he maintained quite a low mental age. They said apparently he had the mental age of a 3-year-old. Stephen actually ended up setting up a consultancy business when he was in his late 20s. And in 1996, when he was 30 years old, he met his wife, Nicola. They moved to a place called Seaham in County Durham, which is where Nicola's family lived. Bob and Pat retired. They enjoyed their retirement life. And I believe there were some bouts of ill health associated with that as well. Bob had arthritis, and of course doing a physically demanding job would be very, very difficult. And also I believe in 2011, Pat suffered a brain hemorrhage. Stephen and Nicola went on to have 3 children, and Bob and Pat loved the fact that, as well as Daniel, they then had 3 grandchildren. They went to see them quite regularly. Stephen owned or was the managing director of 2 particular businesses. They were called UK Business Grants Limited and European Business Support Limited. The business raked in £5 million in income over a 2-year period. And at one point, Stephen had £2 million in his bank account. Stephen and Nicola enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. He bought a Bentley, they went on cruises, specifically the QE2, they went to the Waldorf Astoria in New York. They had a nice big house, a boat, a caravan. Stephen's business involved him and his business partner sourcing grants for small businesses for an upfront fee. Now, in many sources, particularly a documentary on YouTube, have reported this fee to be £300, but other sources I've seen said it varied between £299 and £346. So it depended pretty much, I think, on the size of the business. Now, these were small businesses like shop owners, for example, and small hotels. However, in 1999 and the early 2000s, Trading Standards received a few complaints saying that Stephen's businesses had not made good on their promise to source grants for new businesses. And after an investigation, it was found that Stephen and his business partner had indeed been trading fraudulently. And it turned out that Stephen and his business partner had either done little or nothing for these businesses, literally kept the 300 odd up front and did nothing. So Stephen was actually charged and pled guilty to fraudulent trading. Stephen was given a 12-month sentence, and the judge said that he didn't give him more because Stephen had targeted businesses as opposed to vulnerable people. However, it's still taking money out of the pockets of people who may be looking after vulnerable people or catering to vulnerable people. So, yeah. So Stephen did plead guilty. He was 33 years old at the time, and he served his year in prison, but he was also, as part of a condition of his release, was banned from holding a management or directorial position for 10 years. His business partner got off much lighter because he'd only been in the business for 5 months, and Stephen had been the main villain of the piece. His business partner was given a 6-month sentence suspended for 2 years due to ill health as well. Over the following 13 years, Stephen had numerous jobs in sales, but he didn't really keep many of them, and in late 2011 he was sacked from his last job. He was unemployed, on benefits, he had a wife, he had 3 kids. Having convictions as a teenager, having fraudulent convictions as an adult, it would make it really hard to get a job. So he turned to his parents for financial help. They had occasionally helped him financially over the years, but they knew that their son was in dire straits. And as well as the fact that he had 3 children who were just innocents in all of this, Bob and Pat decided, yes, they would help Stephen financially. They owned the house in Clough Avenue outright, so they decided to release some equity. So they remortgaged the house essentially, releasing around £45,000, which they gave to Stephen in 2 different amounts. One as a deposit for a house, which was worth about £90,000 up in Seaham, and a little bit of as liquid just to keep, to get him going. Bob actually paid quite a huge portion of the monthly mortgage as well. And he also paid some fines and fees for Stephen, as well as paying for things like the kids' holidays. Lesley and her son were still living with Bob and Pat. Daniel was thriving, even though, it said he had severe learning difficulties. He had a loving mother, he had loving grandparents. I'm not sure about Daniel's father. He obviously wasn't in the picture. But Lesley still needed help and care. So it was a good thing she did live with her parents. And the Seddons were very well known for having a set routine. And it was good for Daniel to have a set routine. So in the morning, they would all have breakfast together. But on the 7th of September 2008, Lesley hadn't come down for breakfast. Pat went upstairs, knocked on the door, didn't get an answer, so she went in and she found Lesley in her bed, dead. She had passed away in the night from an epileptic seizure at the age of 40. This was understandably devastating for Bob and Pat, and poor Daniel, he was 13 at the time, and it was not easy for him to be able to comprehend that his mother had died. There was an option for Daniel to go into care, not just because, he was a minor, but because he would need care himself. But Bob and Pat, no. They were going to take care of Daniel, so they became his legal guardians, and Daniel stayed living with them. Just over a year after Lesley's passing, they changed their will so that if Bob died, Pat would get everything. If Pat died, Bob would get everything. But if both of them died, their son Stephen would be their sole beneficiary, and he would then be responsible for Daniel. Once a week, Daniel would spend a day or 2 days with a respite carer called Fergus. And it's important to get respite when you are around-the-clock carer, especially if you are Bob and Pat's age, and if you're someone like Bob who has arthritis, and it's going to be difficult sometimes. So having a day or two respite is essential, and it was good for Daniel as well to be able to have a bit of a break himself, and he enjoyed spending time with his caregiver. On the 20th of March in 2012, Stephen decided that he would take his parents out to celebrate Mother's Day and also to say thank you for their generosity. He hired a BMW and drove from his house in Seddon to their house in Sale. On the way to the restaurant at around 8 p.m, they were travelling in Timperley down a place called Canal Road, and as you can imagine, there was a canal there called Bridgewater Canal. Stephen, somehow, he didn't seem to feel well. He started to clutch his chest and complained to his parents, who were sitting in the back, that he was experiencing chest pains, and his foot hit the gas and he sped up. His parents were yelling at him to slow down, but he didn't slow down. He lost control and the car plunged into Bridgewater Canal. Stephen was able to get himself out of the car relatively quickly, and he was then able to get his nephew and his father out quickly, but his mother, he couldn't get to his mother for some reason. The car was sinking and sinking, but by that point, emergency services had been called by a witness and managed to get Stephen's mother out. When she was out of the car, it turned out that her heart had actually stopped. She'd died. She'd been underwater too long. But luckily, the emergency services were able to resuscitate her at the scene. She spent 3 days in hospital before going home. She made a full recovery. Everything seemed to be okay there. And Stephen was actually hailed a local hero for saving his parents from this tragic accident. He was interviewed by the BBC and Manchester Evening News. He modestly said he wasn't a hero, the rescue workers were the real heroes, and that he just saved people that he loved. Stephen and Bob went back to the site of the crash with the rescue team, and they posed for photos, and it was reported by the Manchester Evening News that even though Stephen appeared to be quite modest and humble, he seemed to be loving the attention and really happy to pose for photos. Bob wasn't really as up for it, and it's more his son that was like, "Come on, Dad, let's do this." Pat and Bob returned to their home, and even though they were both okay, this incident had rattled them a fair bit. Pat did make a recovery, but Bob, he didn't do quite so well, and not long after this crash, he actually had a heart attack. But like with Pat, he made a recovery. It was just taking its toll on them that, they'd lost their daughter not long before this crash where his wife did die, but then was brought back. Yes, she was okay, and then he had a heart attack. It was just one thing after another, and the whole thing about having to help his son with his finances, it was getting a bit much for him. But hey, they carried on. They went back to their normal routine. And on the 2nd of July in 2012, Fergus went to the house and picked up Daniel to take him away. He was going to have him for a few days. Fergus returned to the house on the 6th of July 2012. And every single time that Fergus returned to the house, Pat would always be in the window waiting. And Bob would always be either at the door or at the end of the driveway to welcome Daniel home, and the front door would always be open. The Seddons were also known for never locking their back door. This is how safe this neighbourhood was. Really nice suburban area, really nice area. But Fergus knew that as soon as he saw this, something wasn't right. Something must have happened. Were Pat and Bob okay? So he told Daniel to wait in the minibus. He went to the door and tried it, but it was locked. He knocked, no answer, rang the doorbell, went to the window, knocked, no answer. He couldn't see anyone in there. He couldn't hear anything. It was eerily quiet. Fergus then went to the back of the house and he looked in through the conservatory door. He tried the door, it was locked. Again, really odd. The Seddons never locked the back door. So Fergus peered through the glass and what he saw on the sofa, slumped backwards on the sofa at a slight awkward angle, was Bob. Fergus knocked on the glass, got no reaction from Bob. He called out, no reaction. But then Fergus noticed something that wasn't right. He could see blood on Bob, and lying across Bob's lap was a gun. When the police arrived, they found Bob slumped on the living room sofa with a double-barreled sawn-off shotgun across his lap. He'd been shot around sort of the base of his neck, the top of his chest. And when they went into the hallway, they found Pat dead on the floor with a gunshot wound to her head. The Hoover was upstairs and had been sort of haphazardly almost thrown on the floor, as if it'd just been left there. Pat had come downstairs and had just been shot in the head. So it seemed that Pat had been alerted by something, dropped the Hoover, gone downstairs, and met her fate. Given that Bob was holding the gun, it was initially theorized that Bob had shot his wife and turned the gun on himself. This rumor made the rounds pretty quickly around the neighborhood and around friends and family that the police had theorized that Bob had taken his own life just after taking Pat's. The medical records did show that Bob had indeed been depressed. So this seemed pretty plausible. That was the initial thinking. However, when the ballistics and forensics and pathologists arrived at the scene and did their analysis, it was blatantly obvious. There was overwhelming evidence that this absolutely didn't happen. This was not a murder-suicide. If he held the gun facing him at arm's length, bear in mind this wasn't a handgun, this wasn't a revolver or pistol, this was a shotgun. So it had quite a long barrel even though it had been sawn off. He would have had to have held it at length, pointing towards him. Bob's arms were not long enough to have done that. The angle of the shot to his neck, I mean, bear in mind a shotgun, when you fire it, it's not just one single bullet, it's quite a spray of bullets, and they can tell the distance by the trajectory of the wound inside the body, but also the spread of the wounds, how far away the gun was. The gun must have been at least 1.5 meters, shot by somebody around 5.5 feet off the ground. Even if Bob's arms had been long enough, even if he had shot himself, that gun would have been perpendicular to his body, at a right angle to his body. It wouldn't have then turned sideways and flumped on his lap. He wouldn't have been able to do that himself. He wouldn't have been alive to do that. The recoil, the kickback from that gun would have meant he would have ended up on the floor over across the room. The angle of this gun had been deliberately posed. Also, from the angle of Bob's body, he wasn't just sat on the sofa. He was at a slight angle and was leaning back, and this implied that he was just in the process of starting to get up from the sofa when he was shot and then fell back. The gun had a double barrel, and inside this gun was one spent round, one unspent round. There were 2 shots fired in this house, and the empty cartridge was not found anywhere. So the person who shot Bob then reloaded the gun before shooting Pat. It was theorized that Pat had heard the gunshot, dropped the Hoover, ran downstairs, and was met by her attacker and was shot. The house was torn to pieces upside down and left to right and back to front and goodness knows what else ways you want. No spent cartridge was found. It was definitely an assassin, an assailant. Somebody had done this to these lovely people. It's unclear if Bob's fingers had been tested for gunshot residue, but to be honest, They wouldn't have needed to. There was enough evidence in everything that I've mentioned to confirm he had not shot himself. Pat's body was also found not just on the floor, but it looked like from the angle, and there were some wounds on her arms that showed she'd been wrestled to the floor. It showed that she had tried to fight off whoever it was, and the person hadn't just aimed the gun and shot her, they'd wrestled her to the floor, so they'd subdued her before shooting her. No matter how hard she tried to fight for her life, she was no match for somebody with a shotgun. There were no fingerprints, no DNA at the scene whatsoever, not on the gun, not on the doors, nothing. And there was actually no sign of forced entry, so whoever it was had let themselves in or been let in. Daniel had been away from the Monday the 2nd of July, and Bob and Pat had been discovered dead on the 6th of July. It was important to know within that 4-day window when these two people had died. Bob's medical records showed that he had attended a doctor's appointment the Tuesday the 3rd. On the table in the living room, there were some remnants of some fish and chips, and CCTV showed that around 12:05 on the 4th of July, so on the Wednesday, that's when Bob had bought the fish and chips, and it had been partially eaten. Neighbours and friends of the Seddons knew that these two people stuck to a rigorous routine, day in, day out, and Pat would always put out her light wash in the morning, and in the afternoon she'd put out her dark wash. On the Wednesday, she did put out her whitewash, but there was no dark washing put out on the Wednesday afternoon. And one of the neighbours living across the road, he put his bins out on the Wednesday night to be collected on the Thursday, and he looked across the road and noticed that Bob hadn't put his out. And he noticed the next day they hadn't been put out as well, and the curtains hadn't been drawn closed or open. The neighbours thought this was odd, but not enough to raise suspicion. Telephone records showed that social services had spoken to Bob on that day, on the Wednesday the 4th of July, at approximately 12:24, so not long after he went to get the fish and chips. The next telephone call that was made after that was the first one that day that went unanswered, and that was at 4:21 p.m. So the time of death was narrowed down to between 12:30 on Wednesday the 4th of July to 4:21 that day. But what was the motive? That was what was odd. Background checks confirmed that neither Bob nor Pat had any criminal affiliations or connections. They didn't have any enemies. They were not in any trouble. They weren't in, the only debt they were in was the equity release, but that's paid back when you sell the house or when you pass away. Why were these two people killed? What would have been the motive? They were known as a generous, kind, and lovely couple, very unassuming, kept to themselves, but very friendly. They were on good terms with just about everybody. It was necessary for the police to break the news to Stephen and see him, and when the police told him, he broke down. He was in bits. However, he very, very quickly snapped out of it, and he started talking about what's going to happen to the house. What about the mortgage? My dad pays for the mortgage. What's going to happen? And not once, it was noted, not once did Stephen mention Daniel. And bear in mind, Stephen had agreed to be Daniel's caregiver in the event of Bob and Pat's death. However, further checks on the Seddons' medical records and their legal records revealed a few things which gave the police their first few clues. The day before he died, remember I said Bob had a doctor's appointment. Bob had told him something which the GP was very alarmed by. This issue had been bothering Bob for quite some time, and it had been over 3.5 months since the canal accident, but these feelings had been building up and been harbored for some time, and Bob felt the need to confide in his GP. He reflected on a few things that happened with the crash in the canal, but there were a few things that didn't add up to him. When the car crashed into the canal, Stephen was able to get out of the car very, very quickly. He happened to have a knife on him and was able to cut his seatbelt. Due to the water pressure on the doors, the windows needed to be broken, and Stephen was able to smash the window using a crook lock or steering wheel lock. But why would a brand new BMW, this was a brand new hire car, need a steering wheel lock? Those items aren't really used anymore because most cars, at least nearly all of them, especially a BMW, will have a built-in immobilizer. A crook lock or steering wheel lock, why would the BMW come with that? It seemed that Stephen happened to bring that along, and for what reason? It had been that item he had within reach that he'd used to break the window. What really cemented Bob's concern, though, what really brought it home, was he'd recently been to see Stephen at his house in Seam during a visit to the grandchildren, and he noticed that Stephen had saved an episode of Mythbusters, which is episode 72, titled Underwater Car, about how to escape a submerged vehicle. Bob knew how far-fetched it would be to make such an accusation, but he told his GP something about these little clues were making him think that Stephen had deliberately driven that car into the canal and that he had tried to kill him. You know, that's a very, very difficult accusation to accept, but the GP did his due diligence and he offered to call the police for Bob. Bob said, no thank you, and he said that he would actually confront his son about it later that day. Whether that confrontation took place, and it would have been by phone because driving up to see him is about 2 hours drive, it's unclear as to whether that actually happened. But it should be noted that it was the very day after this appointment that Bob was killed. Upon hearing this from the GP, Stephen Seddon became an official suspect and was arrested. Stephen was held for the mandatory 24 hours which was needed so they could question him, collect more evidence so they could bring some charges. And Stephen did answer some questions, mostly about his movements at the time. He didn't have any explanation for when this accusation that Bob had made was put to Stephen. He just said no comment. The most important thing is to establish an alibi, because an alibi is exactly what will rule you in or rule you out. It doesn't matter how strong your motive is. It doesn't matter what people are saying about you. You physically cannot be in two places at once. Stephen's bank account at the time of these murders showed that he only had £5.45. He had no savings. The £23,000 that his father had given him a few months before had been blown right through. It seemed that Stephen was the only suspect. He was the only one with motive, and this motive appeared to be inheritance. They pressed Stephen for his alibi, and this is the story that he told, and I'm going to refer to my notes here. On Monday, the 2nd of July 2012, Stephen had taken his wife and children to Carla Cran Caravan Park, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, in Fleetwood in Lancashire for a short caravan holiday, which was over 2.5 hours drive away. I believe it was just his 2 youngest children that went with him and his wife. However, when they arrived, Stephen remembered that he had a job centre appointment to sign on at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, the 4th of July. And it's true, he did have that appointment. He said he had to go, he had to attend it. And Fleetwood is 2.5 hours drive away. So at around 5:24 in the morning of Wednesday, the 4th of July, Stephen got into his dark blue VW Passat and he drove all the way back home to see him to his house. He said he had a few cappuccinos and then he had a sleep. Then he woke up remembering his appointment. He didn't have much time to spare. He went to get the car out the garage, but the electric was off and the garage had an electric door. The electricity had been turned off, and then Stephen remembered that the electricity company had told him, had sent him a letter saying that that particular day for a few hours, the electricity will be temporarily switched off, maybe due to some maintenance. He couldn't get the car out the garage, so his option then was to run to the job centre. And he did arrive. He arrived at 9:57 a.m. and the people at the job centre and the CCTV footage from inside the job centre showed he did arrive. He did indeed have an appointment. The staff did mention that he was out of breath. He said he'd been running. After the appointment, he went and took some money out of a cash point. Then he went back to his home in Seam. He had another nap. And then in the afternoon, when the electricity was back on, he was able to retrieve his car. And then he drove to get some beers and some snacks at a shop in Seam before driving on to Fleetwood. He confirmed that between arriving home in Seaham and then going back to Fleetwood, he was in Seaham all day. He had no access to a vehicle. The police followed up these lines of inquiry, and it turned out that yes, Stephen was telling the truth. He had indeed been at the job centre. There was CCTV footage confirming that. The letter from the electric company was retrieved. The company confirmed, yes, the electric was switched off that day. And it was also shown that he did actually arrive at Asda in Byron Place Retail Park using a cash point at 10:36 a.m. Also, CCTV showed him at the shop buying beer and then returning to his family late that afternoon in Fleetwood. To bolster Stephen's alibi, his mobile phone location was tracked, and it was indeed in Seaham all day on the 4th of July 2012, so it seemed that Stephen's story checked out. However, there was a problem. Although Stephen's actions in the morning and the late afternoon could be independently verified, there was no independent witnesses or anything else other than his mobile phone being located in Seaham that corroborated that he spent pretty much the whole day in his house having a nap, which he said he did, which is the window of opportunity for when Bob and Pat were killed. Police returned to the CCTV footage of Stephen arriving at the job centre, and the angle of the camera shows the entrance to the job centre and some other places along that road, but it also has a very, very faint view of a side road in the top right hand corner, and it's not very clear at all. It's not full. But the police saw that just before Stephen went running around the corner to the job centre, a blue car pulled up. And then when Stephen left the job centre, he went running towards that car, and then the car pulled away. While Stephen was in the job centre, a bus went past, and buses have CCTV, so the police got hold of that footage, and indeed, it showed a blue car was parked on the side of the road. The car shown was not Stephen's VW Passat, which was also dark blue. It was a dark blue 3 Series BMW. Nicholas Seddon's brother, Robert Stockton, owned such a vehicle, so Stephen Seddon's brother-in-law. When Robert Stockton was interviewed, he confirmed that Stephen had indeed asked to borrow his car that day for his job centre appointment, and he borrowed it for quite some time. If Stephen had indeed not committed the crime, for what reason would he have to lie about him not having access to a vehicle and claiming that he ran all the way to the job centre and then was able to walk back home? So the police now could identify this vehicle. They had the registration number, and therefore they could use registration recognition software and other CCTV footage between Seaham and Sale and in other areas in northern England to determine the movements of this vehicle on that day. Various recognition software and CCTV showed that the vehicle hadn't just been used to take Stephen to and from the job centre. He had also driven it to Darlington, which is just a little bit further south of Seaham, and indeed it showed that very same vehicle in Sale. The vehicle was spotted driving down Manor Avenue in Sale by a camera situated at Nisa store at 1:52 p.m. And then the same camera at the Nisa store picks the car up again at 2:03 p.m. going in the opposite direction. These locations are literally less than half a mile from Bob and Pat's house. 2.5 hours later, at 4:36 p.m, Stephen Seddon is shown on CCTV at Home Bargains in Byron Retail Park in Seaham buying beer. He also met up with a family member. On his drive that evening back to Fleetwood, he's also caught at a petrol station buying snacks. So Robert Stockton's car was seen not just driving to the job centre and back, it was seen driving to Darlington, to Sale, back to Seaham, and then at that point, that's when Stephen was able to retrieve his Passat from inside his garage. He no longer needed the BMW. The murder weapon was examined, and it was found that the serial number had been removed. It had been sawn off, so they couldn't identify it by the serial number. So it indicated it was a stolen weapon. So looking through inquiries of reports of thefts of weapons made in that, say, last year or so, found that there was a similar kind of weapon reported stolen in a place called Crook, which is near Seaham. Dennis Dolphin had reported his shotgun being stolen, and when shown pictures of the now sawn-off shotgun, he confirmed it was indeed his gun. That gun had been stolen 6 months prior to the incident. The trip to Darlington was also a crucial part of this. It was actually found that Stephen had driven there to meet a man called Brian Chopper, who was a criminal associate, and it is speculated that this is when Stephen purchased the gun. Investigations were also reopened into the canal crash that had been closed and regarded as just a freak accident. There didn't seem to be any reason at the time to investigate it. But now these allegations and now this double murder was coming to light, it meant that this needed to be looked at again. And there was a lot of conflicting information given by Stephen, but also the eyewitness testimony. There were 3 people who had witnessed it. There was 2 boys on the canal bank and a woman who had called emergency services. And they told some things to the police that didn't seem too suspicious at the time, but looking back, when all of these things added up, it indicated that maybe Bob's hunch was right, that this was indeed a deliberate attempt on their lives. The woman who called emergency services said that somebody was driving at her at speed, or in her direction at speed. And this is what caught her attention, because normally if someone has stolen a car and they're joyriding, they will drive very, very fast to get away. And this is what made her think this was potentially a joyrider, but then it somehow just veered off and went straight into the canal. The location of entry to the canal was also interesting, because there were grass verges and shrubs and trees and posts and goodness knows what lining the canal, but the point of entry, there was no obstacles whatsoever, so it just happened to crash at a part where there would be nothing to stop it from entering the water. Stephen also said that when he was experiencing the chest pains, the car hit a brick or a stone or a curb, something, and he heard a bang, and that's what made him veer off. But there was nothing at all along that road to suggest that he hit anything or anything that would have made him veer off the road. 2 other eyewitnesses, the 2 young men on the canal bank who actually helped to get Daniel out of the water when Stephen managed to push him to the shore, they told police that when the car entered the water and Stephen was able to get out by breaking his window, he clambered onto the top. So he was on the roof of the car, or on the bonnet of the car. He was sitting on it and trying to kick at the windows with his bare heels. His shoes had come off. And he said what he was trying to do is break the windows with his feet. The 2 eyewitnesses tried to yell at Stephen repeatedly to get off the car because he was pushing it down even faster. He was accelerating its rate of descent. And it took quite a lot of persuasion for Stephen to actually get off the roof of the car and then use other means to get Daniel and his father out. The hire car company revealed something interesting too, that Stephen, who was using an alias of Nick, N-I-C, hired not only this car, but he'd also hired another car a week before. And the forms that he filled in were compared. The hire car that he'd used the week before had the normal insurance, which you normally would get with a hire car. But on the BMW, he paid a little bit extra, which would waive his excess. What was also suggested, that because Daniel was in the car on the 20th of March at the time of this crash, and that after the first round of the shotgun was fired, the gun was reloaded, that Stephen may have been intending to kill Daniel as well, or at least said if Daniel had been home, he would have been killed as well, but it wasn't necessary for him to die. But he wouldn't have ruled out killing Daniel, and Daniel would have undoubtedly died in that car if Stephen had gone ahead with his plan. And it seemed that the eyewitnesses thwarted his attempt, and he had to abort his plan to kill his parents in the canal and make it look like it was an accident, and he helped to free his parents from the canal. Interviews with 2 more people revealed that they'd had conversations with Stephen, which at the time didn't seemed quite innocuous. But obviously after Pat and Bob's death, they were very, very damning. One of them was the owner of a pub called the Mitchell, and they were looking to sell up. And Stephen told them that he wanted to buy the pub. He actually had meetings with them in order to negotiate a sale. Stephen had nowhere near the amount of funds needed to buy a pub. Was he looking to buy the pub with the money he'd get from his parents' house? When Stephen's 13-year-old son got into a little bit of trouble at school, he was called into the school and spoke to the teacher. And he said to the teacher, "I'm going to be coming into some money very soon, so I can definitely reward my son if he's a good boy." He said it was an inheritance he was going to get. This was in June of 2012. This was 3 months after the first attempt on his parents' life, and a month or just a couple of weeks before he successfully killed his parents. It was estimated that after paying back the equity and all the other expenses, Stephen would have inherited £230,000. It was widely believed that after remortgaging the house, they may have had to have done this again, and it would have diminished and reduced the net worth of his parents, so that when they died, Stephen would have to pay so much more back that he wouldn't get very much. So they had to die now. Although the part of Stephen's phone being in Seam all day on the 4th of July 2012, normally the defense would jump on that. They would go, right, well, that's proof. If his phone was in Seam, he was with his phone. CCTV footage, again, loads of it was examined, and it was confirmed before he even went to Darlington. He went to a relative's house, and it was theorized that this was where he dropped off his phone. He wanted his phone to be kept in Seam. They looked again at the phone records and found that there were a few messages and a few phone calls that came through to this phone in that window of opportunity that went unanswered, apart from one phone call. I'm not sure what time it was, but it was during this window. This call was made from a loan company. Now, Stephen was, he was looking to get loans sometimes. He was using his alias of Nick still. The person who answered the phone said that the loan company would have to call back later because Nick wasn't there. And the reason why they know that is because companies record their calls. They were also able to compare the male voice who answered that phone call with a genuine call that Stephen had had with another loan company the week before. They were different. So that was proof that Stephen had not answered that phone. It was also theorized that the person with whom he was meeting up in Home Bargains at 1636 on the 4th of July was the one to whom he had entrusted his phone and was therefore getting it back. The police did initially describe the perpetrator before they arrested Stephen as someone as being forensically aware because they'd used gloves and not left any DNA or any other identifiable marks or traces at the scene. They'd even gone so far as to leave their phone in a location knowing that the towers can ping off that phone. And having a stolen gun with the serial number removed, that's another way to cover your tracks. But Stephen made a crucial mistake. He used a relative's vehicle. He already knew that the electricity would be turned off that day, so it just happened to be ever so convenient that he got back to his home, put the car in the garage. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have a garage, but when I was a bit younger, we had a garage with a driveway, and 9 times out of 10, during the day, we would leave the car on the driveway just in case we needed it. At night, we put it in the garage. Now, if he was just driving home to have a nap and then go out to the job centre, why would you then put it in the garage and then put the door down? He knew that the electric was going to be turned off that day. He needed an excuse to not have access to a vehicle. With all this evidence stacking against him, you would think that Stephen would believe or know that his number was up. There's no way he can wriggle out of it. But no, he pleaded not guilty to both counts of murder and the 2 attempted murder counts. 4 counts were brought against him. Stephen did something which a lot of defense attorneys will advise against doing. He took the stand in his own defense. He vehemently denied killing his parents. He asked how he could account for his movements in Sale that day. And Stephen once again revealed that he had lied repeatedly throughout this entire investigation. He told police he had no access to a vehicle. And now he relented and said, yes, I did go to Sale. Yes, I did use my brother-in-law's car, but it's because some criminal associates of mine had a holdall of, well, I presume was drugs. I didn't really look inside it. Had to be driven to somewhere near Sale, and then the money in repayment was given to me when I went back home to see him. That's why I was doing it, and that's why I lied initially. And when he was asked, who do you think killed your parents, he suspected that it was a criminal gang. Now, this sounds, I suppose, like a plausible theory. Gang members will sometimes target or assassinate family members to punish people. However, when Stephen was questioned about who it was he was assisting that day with these drugs, apparently, and who it was he thought had killed his parents, he said, quote, "Operating that league with most people, you don't mention names. It could get you killed. I'm sorry, but if your parents have been killed and you're the one who's being accused, I couldn't care less about grassing somebody up. Tell them what you know, because that could be your way out. Because if it were a criminal network that had done this, and if you have information about it and it could A, clear your name, and B, bring the real people to justice, it could also mean you get your inheritance and Daniel will then be looked after." And the suggestion of potentially killing his nephew, Stephen accused the prosecution as being sick for just suggesting it. However, despite him giving these so-called explanations for his movements in Sale and what had happened to his parents, he provided no evidence whatsoever to back this up. After 18 hours of deliberation, they found Stephen Seddon guilty of all counts, and the verdict was delivered on the 27th of March, 2013. So he was guilty of the double murder of his parents and the double attempted murder of his parents. When he was convicted, Stephen shouted in the court, quote, "No, not at all. They were not murdered by me at all. I'm an innocent man." The judge told him to keep quiet. What Stephen did was described by the judge as an execution. And although their last moments of life, they may have seen his face, they may have realized this was their son unless he was wearing something like a mask to disguise himself. But the judge did make a note that their deaths were, quote, "mercifully swift." The judge threw the book at Stephen, quite rightly, detailing what his motives were: money, gain, greed, get out of trouble. And the police also made the suggestion in the documentary that's on YouTube that the money he would have got from his parents may not have lasted him for the rest of his life. He may not have been a successful landlord if he'd ever bought that pub. The judge said he was an ungrateful son. He had an insatiable thirst for money. He sponged off his kind-hearted parents, and they were devoted to him. They were devoted to Daniel. They did so much for them. They were selfless people. The family liaison officer for the Seddon family read the following quote: "The past 9 months have been a very sad and emotional time for our family. The shock of having both Pat and Bob taken from us in such horrifying and tragic circumstances has left us feeling numb. Pat and Bob were a kind, loving, and selfless couple who will be missed by their family, friends, and especially their grandson Daniel, who they cared for with great love and affection. We would like to now be left in peace to mourn the deaths of Pat and Bob and be allowed to remember them as the loving couple that they were." At the age of 46, Stephen Seddon was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 40 years. Some accounts say that he was given life without parole, but after looking at the actual statement from the judge, which is available online, it specifically says 40 years, that he'll be 86 even before he's considered for parole, and even then he will be on license, so he may well end up going back, if he does anything. He may not even be alive, he may well die in prison. And to be honest, I reckon that's all he deserves. And who I feel mostly sorry for is Daniel and Stephen's children. These kids have now lost their dad to prison, they've lost their grandparents, and Daniel, he lost his mum, and now he's lost his grandparents, and his uncle is in prison. He's now in care. One neighbour said they were fantastic people. They lived here for years and were always so kind with my kids and other kids on the street. It's a massive shock. They were such an ordinary, down-to-earth couple, and you could never see them being involved in something like this. My heart just goes out to their family. We know them well, and they are such a nice, unassuming family, and I've no idea what they must be going through. Another neighbour said they had a fair amount of bad luck in recent years, and I know Bob had been feeling down. They'd had a lifetime of bad luck over a very short period. It's all come as a complete shock. They were just lovely, mild-mannered people. You couldn't have asked for nicer neighbours. They've always been here and everyone knew them on the street, but now suddenly this has happened." Manchester Evening News had actually widely reported the canal incident, again portraying Stephen as this hero. But then they had to say, hang on, Stephen lied to us. The story that we portrayed last time wasn't true. I mean, it wasn't their fault, it was Stephen's fault. This was an attempt on their lives, and now he's succeeded. He still to this day protests his innocence. I don't know if he's tried to appeal. It amazes me when people are given irrefutable evidence, you did this, and they know they did that, and they still say no, 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 no. When you look at psychopaths, there's always a trail that you can follow. I mean, yes, you can say that Lesley's epilepsy, which was diagnosed when Stephen was 8, and attention on her may have triggered something in him to go off the rails like he did at 13. That's not an excuse. And even if people do go off the rails, they have plenty of opportunities to turn their lives around. They weren't abusive parents. He hadn't had a terrible upbringing. It seems to me that he had a predisposition to psychopathy. And maybe there were some triggers that set this off. Parasitic, sponging off his parents. He was a liar. He was completely shameless. And he killed his parents and was absolutely happy for his nephew to die. Now, I'm going to say something which I have to say is just purely my opinion, not accusing anyone of anything. But Lesley's death, yes, it was confirmed she died in her sleep from epilepsy. It just seems very convenient and coincidental that it was just a few years before her parents died, and Lesley would have got half of everything. Maybe her death was planned too, I don't know. That's just an opinion. It could potentially be. I don't believe that's ever been looked into. But that's just a thought that I have. Anyway, thank you very much for watching there, my lovely little berries. If you're still watching this so far, because I know not everybody watches right to the very, very end, I'm just going to give you a big hug. Give yourself a hug and a pat on the back, and stay cool in this hot weather. Take care. See you later, little berries. Bye-bye.